He invited his African ex-girlfriend to his wedding to get revenge, but what she did was unforgettable. What happens when love turns into a bitter plan for revenge? Ethan Carter, a self-made millionaire, thought he had it all: wealth, power, and a bride who fit perfectly into his world of prestige. But deep down, his heart carried the sting of betrayal from his past. To settle the score, Ethan invited his ex-girlfriend, Amara Johnson, to his extravagant wedding, hoping to flaunt his new life and success. But Amara, a strong and resilient woman, wasn't the type to be humiliated. What unfolded that day wasn't the revenge Ethan had planned. It was a moment that changed his life forever. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring you more inspiring and dramatic stories like this one. Ethan Carter stood in his penthouse apartment, overlooking the glittering city skyline. His world was one of power, luxury, and influence, a far cry from where he'd started. Dressed in a tailored suit and holding a glass of vintage whiskey, Ethan looked every bit the self-made millionaire. But the weight of his past lingered like a shadow. On the marble counter lay an embossed wedding invitation, its gold lettering catching the light. The name Amara Johnson stood out, bold and striking, just like the woman herself. It had been 3 years since their breakup, but Ethan remembered every detail: her sharp wit, her unwavering principles, and the way she'd walked out of his life without looking back. "She'll see now," Ethan muttered, his voice edged with bitterness. "She'll see everything she gave up." His assistant, Ryan, entered the room with a tablet in hand. "Sir, the final guest list has been confirmed. Anything else to add?" "Yes," Ethan said, picking up the invitation. "Send this to Amara Johnson. Make sure it's delivered personally. I want her to feel the weight of this." Ryan hesitated for a moment. "Are you sure about this? Inviting an ex to your wedding?" Ethan's sharp gaze silenced him. "I'm very sure. Just handle it." In a quiet suburb miles away, Amara Johnson sat in her small but cozy home, flipping through the pages of a book. Her life was far removed from Ethan's world of extravagance, but she had built something meaningful: her art, her community, and her independence. The doorbell rang, breaking her focus. When she opened the door, a well-dressed courier handed her an ornate envelope. "Delivery for Miss Amara Johnson," he said with a polite nod. Amara frowned, taking the envelope. The gold-trimmed edges and heavy paper spoke of wealth and precision. As she opened it, her breath caught. The invitation read, "Ethan Carter and Rachel Montgomery request the honor of your presence at their wedding." Her heart pounded as a flood of memories rushed back: their passionate arguments, their shared dreams, and the painful day she'd left him. Why would Ethan invite her to his wedding? "Why now?" she whispered, staring at the elegant script. For a moment, anger flared. She knew Ethan well enough to suspect his motives weren't pure. But another part of her, the part that had grown stronger since their breakup, felt a spark of resolve. "This isn't about him," Amara said aloud. "This is about showing him who I've become." With renewed determination, she placed the invitation on her kitchen table and booked a flight to New York. Whatever Ethan had planned, she was ready to face it head-on. At his wedding venue, a luxurious estate filled with opulent decor and bustling staff, Ethan reviewed final preparations. The gardens were adorned with white roses, chandeliers sparkled in the evening light, and every detail spoke of perfection. But as Ethan walked through the grand hall, his thoughts drifted to Amara. He pictured her walking through the doors, her presence commanding the room as it always had. "Are you ready for this?" Rachel, his fiancée, asked, appearing at his side. Her tone was warm, but her eyes searched his face for something more. Ethan gave a tight smile. "Of course. Everything is going exactly as planned." But deep down, Ethan couldn't shake the unease brewing within him. He had orchestrated every detail of this wedding, yet the thought of seeing Amara again unsettled him in a way he hadn't anticipated. As the day drew closer, Ethan realized that this wasn't just about revenge. It was about closure, or so he told himself. The grand estate buzzed with final preparations as the day of Ethan Carter's wedding approached. Florists worked tirelessly, placing fresh roses along the marble pathways leading to the ceremony, while staff polished silverware until it gleamed. Ethan watched it all from the balcony of his master suite, his face a mask of calm control, though his thoughts were far from serene. He had planned every detail meticulously, including the invitation to Amara Johnson. The idea of her walking into his carefully curated world filled him with a mix of anticipation and unease. Part of him wanted her to see his success, to witness how far he had come without her. But another part, one he refused to acknowledge, wondered if her presence might stir something in him he thought was long buried. Amara stepped out of the taxi, her heels clicking against the cobblestone driveway as she took in the grandeur of the estate. It was as extravagant as she had imagined, with towering archways, pristine gardens, and an air of exclusivity that reminded her of why she had walked away from Ethan in the first place. His world had always felt like a gilded cage, beautiful but suffocating. Adjusting the hem of her sleek emerald dress, she took a deep breath. "You can do this," she whispered to herself. As she approached the entrance, the staff greeted her with polite professionalism, guiding her toward the grand ballroom where the rehearsal dinner was taking place. She felt the weight of the stares from the other guests, their curiosity palpable. "Isn't that Amara Johnson?" someone whispered. "The ex?" She straightened her back and lifted her chin, refusing to let their whispers faze her. If Ethan wanted her to feel out of place, he would be sorely disappointed. Inside the ballroom, Ethan stood near the head of a long, ornately set table, flanked by Rachel and their closest friends. His tailored suit fit him perfectly, exuding the same effortless confidence that had once drawn Amara to him. But when his eyes caught hers across the room, his composure faltered. Amara was stunning. Her emerald dress hugged her figure perfectly, and her natural grace commanded the attention of everyone in the room. Ethan had prepared for this moment, yet seeing her in person stirred a mix of emotions he wasn't ready for. Rachel noticed his sudden distraction and followed his gaze. Her smile tightened. "Who's that?" she asked, her tone light but sharp. "An old acquaintance," Ethan replied smoothly, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. As Amara entered the room, the buzz of conversation quieted. Ethan met her halfway, his expression unreadable. "Amara," he said, his voice low. "You came." She smiled, a mix of warmth and defiance in her expression. "Did you think I wouldn't?" For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their shared history filling the space between them. Then Rachel approached, her presence breaking the tension. "Ethan, aren't you going to introduce me?" she said, her voice sweet but laced with curiosity. "This is Amara Johnson," Ethan said. "An old friend." "Old friend," Amara repeated, her smile not reaching her eyes. "It's nice to meet you, Rachel." Rachel extended a perfectly manicured hand. "Likewise." Ethan has told me so much about his past, but I don't think he mentioned you. Amara chuckled softly. I suppose some parts of the past are harder to talk about than others. Rachel's gaze flicked between Ethan and Amara, her smile unwavering but her eyes sharp. Well, I hope you enjoy the evening. I'll leave you two to catch up. As Rachel walked away, Amara turned to Ethan, her expression hardening. So what's the real reason you invited me, Ethan? Don't tell me you've suddenly developed a fondness for closure. Ethan's jaw tightened. I thought you might like to see what you walked away from. Amara laughed, the sound light but cutting. Ah, there it is, the arrogance I remember so well. The rest of the evening was a careful dance of tension and unspoken words. Amara mingled effortlessly with the other guests, her charm and wit drawing admiration. Ethan watched from a distance, his emotions a tangled mess of pride, anger, and something dangerously close to regret. As the dinner wound down, Ethan found Amara on the terrace, gazing out at the sprawling gardens. You've always known how to command a room, he said, stepping beside her. And you've always known how to fill one with unnecessary grandeur, she replied, her tone light but pointed. He sighed, his defenses slipping. Why did you come, Amara? She turned to face him, her eyes searching his. Because I wanted to see if you'd changed. But it seems you're still playing the same games. Ethan frowned, her words cutting deeper than he cared to admit. And what about you? Still pretending to be above it all? Amara shook her head, a soft smile on her lips. No, Ethan, I'm not pretending. I just know who I am now. Do you? Before he could respond, Rachel's voice called from inside. Ethan, it's time for the toast. Amara gave him one last look, her expression a mix of challenge and pity, before walking back into the ballroom. Ethan stood there, the weight of her words pressing down on him as he realized this reunion wasn't going at all how he had planned. Ethan sat at the head of the table, his glass raised as guests clinked their champagne flutes in celebration. Rachel beamed beside him, her radiant smile drawing admiring glances from the room. But Ethan's mind was elsewhere. Across the table, Amara's laughter echoed softly as she charmed a group of guests. Her ease and confidence, so familiar yet distant, unsettled him. Rachel leaned closer, her voice low. You've been distracted all evening. Are you sure everything is okay? Ethan forced a smile, masking the storm inside. Of course. Just thinking about the big day tomorrow. Rachel's gaze lingered, but she didn't press further. Amara, meanwhile, was keenly aware of Ethan's glances. She'd come prepared for his games, but the undercurrent of tension between them was stronger than she'd expected. It wasn't just bitterness she sensed. It was something deeper, unresolved. As the evening wound down, Amara stepped out onto the terrace, seeking a moment of quiet. The cool night air was a welcome contrast to the warmth of the ballroom. The distant sound of laughter faded as she gazed out at the moonlit gardens. I figured I'd find you out here. Ethan's voice broke the silence. She didn't turn. Her posture calm, but her tone sharp. Did you come to gloat, Ethan? Or is this part of your plan to remind me what I left behind? Ethan stepped closer, his confidence faltering. You think you've got me all figured out, don't you? Finally she turned, her eyes meeting his. I don't have to figure you out. You haven't changed, Ethan. You're still trying to prove yourself to everyone around you, even to me. He bristled, her words hitting their mark. And you're still pretending to be above it all. But if that were true, you wouldn't have come. Amara crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. You invited me because you wanted something, Ethan, but you're not going to get it. Ethan's frustration bubbled to the surface. You don't know what I want. Amara took a step closer, her voice steady. Maybe I don't, but I know you won't find it in revenge. Whatever you think this is, Ethan, it's not about me. It's about you and the things you're too afraid to face. Her words lingered as she turned and walked back inside, leaving Ethan alone on the terrace, the weight of her accusations sinking in. The next morning, the estate was alive with activity. The wedding staff rushed to perfect every detail, and guests mingled in anticipation of the ceremony. Ethan moved through the preparations like a man on autopilot, his polished exterior betraying none of his inner turmoil. Rachel found him in the lounge, adjusting his tie in front of a gilded mirror. You seem tense, she observed, placing a hand on his arm. I'm fine, he replied curtly, brushing her off. Her eyes narrowed. Ethan, what's going on? You've been distant since the rehearsal dinner. He hesitated, searching for the right words. It's nothing, just nerves. Rachel's smile tightened. If there's something you're not telling me, now's the time. Before he could respond, a staff member interrupted to announce that the ceremony was about to begin. Ethan exhaled, grateful for the reprieve, but Rachel's lingering gaze told him this conversation was far from over. As the guests took their seats in the garden, Ethan stood at the altar, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The string quartet played softly, the melody blending with the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Rachel began her walk down the aisle, radiant in her gown, but Ethan's attention drifted once again to the audience. There, in the second row, sat Amara. She wasn't trying to stand out, yet she did effortlessly. Her presence felt like a spotlight, highlighting every insecurity and doubt Ethan had tried to bury. The ceremony began, the officiant's words blurring in Ethan's mind. When it came time for the vows, Rachel turned to him, her eyes full of expectation. Ethan, she said softly, prompting him. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. Instead, he glanced at Amara, her expression unreadable but steady. In that moment, the truth hit him like a thunderbolt. This wasn't about revenge, or even about Amara. It was about the emptiness he'd been trying to fill with power, wealth, and control. Ethan? Rachel's voice was sharper now, tinged with confusion. He faltered, his gaze dropping to the ground. The guests murmured, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. Rachel's expression shifted from confusion to realization. Ethan, she said quietly, her voice breaking. What's going on? He looked up, Anamiti, meeting her gaze with a mixture of guilt and regret. I can't do this. The silence following Ethan's confession was deafening. Rachel stood frozen at the altar, her face a mixture of shock and humiliation, as the whispers among the guests grew louder. Ethan's chest tightened, but he didn't let himself look back. His polished shoes clicked against the stone aisle as he walked away, leaving behind the life he had so carefully constructed. The golden arches of the garden blurred in his vision as he entered the estate's main hall. His breathing was uneven, his thoughts chaotic. He had spent years building an image of success, power, and control, only to unravel it in front of everyone who mattered. As the grand doors swung shut behind him, a voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. Ethan, he turned sharply. Amara stood there, arms crossed, her emerald dress catching the faint light streaming through the windows. Her expression wasn't triumphant or mocking. It was calm, steady. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. Yes, I did. Ethan replied, his voice hoarse. I couldn't go through with it. Not like that. Amara tilted her head, studying him. So what now? You humiliated your fiancé, shocked all your guests, and probably set fire to your reputation. Was it worth it? Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. I just know I couldn't lie anymore. Back in the garden, chaos reigned. Guests murmured in disbelief. Some consoling Rachel, others speculating about what had gone wrong. Rachel's parents were livid, speaking in hushed but heated tones with the wedding planner. Rachel herself remained at the altar, her hands gripping her bouquet so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Eventually she turned and walked briskly toward the estate, ignoring the swarm of concerned faces. When she reached the hall, she froze at the sight of Ethan and Amara, standing close, their voices low but intense. You couldn't have waited one more day? Rachel's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. Ethan turned, guilt written across his face. Rachel! No, she snapped, her eyes blazing. You don't get to explain. You made your choice, there's nothing left to say. Amara stepped back, clearly unwilling to escalate the confrontation. This isn't my place, she said softly. Rachel's gaze shifted to her, cold and accusatory. You. This is about you, isn't it? I knew something was off the moment I saw you. Amara met her glare with quiet dignity. I didn't ask to be here, Rachel. That was Ethan's decision. Rachel's laugh was bitter. Of course it was. He's always been good at making decisions that ruin other people's lives. Ethan stepped forward. Rachel, this isn't about Amara. This is about me. I wasn't ready for this marriage. I thought I was, but I wasn't. Spare me the self-reflection, Rachel said coldly. You just wanted to prove something. To her, to me, to yourself. And in the process, you destroyed everything. As Rachel stormed out, Ethan felt the weight of her words settle over him. He turned to Amara, his shoulders slumping. She's right. I ruined everything. Amara shook her head. You told the truth, Ethan. That's not the same as ruining everything. It's a start. He looked at her, the vulnerability in his eyes catching her off guard. Why did you come, Amara? Why didn't you just throw the invitation away? She hesitated, then sighed. Because I wanted to see if you'd changed. And for what it's worth, today proved that maybe you have. Just a little. Her words were a lifeline, but Ethan still felt unmoored. What am I supposed to do now? That's not for me to decide, Amara said gently. But maybe it's time you stopped trying to prove yourself to everyone else and started figuring out what you really want. Ethan nodded slowly, her words resonating more deeply than he cared to admit. Thank you, Amara. She gave him a small smile, the kind that held more understanding than pity. Good luck, Ethan. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Ethan alone in the cavernous hall. The aftermath of Ethan's decision was both immediate and overwhelming. By the time the guests had left the estate, whispers of the wedding's collapse had already begun spreading through social circles. Ethan knew the fallout would come swiftly. His reputation, his business alliances, and the carefully crafted image of success he had spent years building. But none of it felt as heavy as the emptiness now lingering in the grand estate. Sitting alone in his study, Ethan swirled a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring at the flickering light of the fireplace. The silence of the room was deafening, amplifying every doubt that gnawed at him. Was Rachel right? Had he destroyed everything for nothing? A soft knock on the door broke his thoughts. It was Ryan, his assistant. Sir, Ryan began cautiously, stepping into the room. There's already been some chatter among the board. They're concerned about how this situation might reflect on the company. Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. Let them talk. I'll handle it. Ryan hesitated. And Ms. Montgomery's family? They've issued a statement about the wedding. It's not flattering. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. Of course it's not. Do you need me to manage anything? Ryan asked, his tone more sympathetic now. Ethan shook his head. No, this is something I have to deal with myself. Ryan nodded, lingering for a moment before leaving Ethan to his thoughts. Elsewhere, Amara sat in her hotel room staring at her suitcase. She had come to the wedding expecting a battle of wits, prepared to stand her ground against Ethan's games. But the man she had encountered wasn't the one that she had left behind. Ethan's vulnerability, his uncharacteristic honesty, lingered in her mind. Despite everything, there was a part of her that still saw the man she had once fallen for, the ambition, the charm, and the capacity for change. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Ethan. Thank you for coming. I need to see you before you leave, please. Amara sighed, debating whether to respond. Against her better judgment, she typed back a short reply. Meet me tomorrow morning at the cafe near my hotel, 10 a.m. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the cafe early, his nerves betraying his usual composure. Dressed in a simple blazer and jeans, he looked out of place among the relaxed morning crowd. When Amara walked in, wearing a casual yet elegant outfit, Ethan felt his breath catch. She was as composed as ever, her presence commanding the room without effort. Ethan, she greeted, sitting across from him. Amara, he replied, his voice softer than usual. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was palpable, a mix of unresolved history and unspoken emotions. Why did you ask me here? Amara finally asked, breaking the silence. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Because I needed to apologize. For everything. Inviting you to the wedding, trying to prove something. It was petty and wrong. Amara raised an eyebrow, surprised by his candor. Go on. He leaned forward, his voice steady but sincere. Seeing you again made me realize how much I've been hiding. From myself. From everyone. I've spent years chasing this idea of what success should look like, and I let it consume me. But yesterday, for the first time, I finally stopped pretending. Amara studied him, her expression unreadable. And what are you going to do now, Ethan? I don't know, he admitted. But I want to figure it out, and I know it starts with being honest, with myself, and with the people who matter. She nodded, her gaze softening. It's a start. Amara, Ethan said, his voice steady. I don't expect you to forgive me or even to care about what happens next. But I need you to know that you were right. About everything. And I'm sorry for how I treated you back then. Amara leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Ethan, I didn't come here to fix you, she said gently. That's something only you can do, but I'm glad you're finally starting to see it for yourself. Ethan nodded, her words sinking in. Thank you, Amara, for everything. She stood, grabbing her bag. Take care of yourself, Ethan, and try not to burn any more bridges. As she walked out of the cafe, Ethan watched her go, a sense of clarity settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, not for what he had lost, but for what he could build anew. Ethan walked back to his penthouse, the city's morning rush humming around him. For years, He had moved through this same bustling environment, but today it felt different. The facade he had so carefully maintained was gone, stripped away by the events of the past 24 hours. What remained was a man who had spent so long chasing an image of success that he had forgotten what success truly meant. As he stepped into the quiet sanctuary of his home, Ethan's phone buzzed. It was an email from the board of his company requesting an urgent meeting to discuss the fallout from the canceled wedding. He stared at the screen, the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. He dialed Ryan's number. "Schedule the meeting for this afternoon," he said. Ryan hesitated on the other end. "Are you sure, sir?" The tone of the message, "I'm sure," Ethan interrupted. "I need to face this." The meeting room in Carter Enterprises was a stark contrast to the grandiose estate Ethan had left behind. Sleek and modern, it was filled with the company's top executives, all waiting with guarded expressions. Ethan entered with a calm resolve, his tailored suit impeccable, though his demeanor lacked its usual sharpness. "Good afternoon," he began, taking his seat at the head of the table. The murmurs quieted, and the head of public relations, Linda Brooks, leaned forward. "Ethan, the news of the canceled wedding has already spread. It's all over the media. There's speculation about your personal life and what this could mean for the company's image." Ethan nodded, meeting her gaze directly. "I'm aware of the headlines, and I take full responsibility for the situation. But let me make one thing clear. My personal life does not define this company. Our values, our innovation, and our commitment to excellence do." The room was silent as Ethan continued, his tone firm but composed. "What happened yesterday was a wake-up call for me. I've been chasing perfection, trying to meet expectations that weren't my own. That ends today. From now on, this company will reflect not just success, but integrity." Linda raised an eyebrow. "And how do you plan to repair the damage to your reputation?" Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady. "By being honest, I'm not perfect, and I won't pretend to be. But I'll rebuild, brick by brick, with transparency and accountability. That starts with this company." The board exchanged glances, murmurs rippling through the room. Ethan could feel the skepticism, but he also sensed a shift, a grudging respect for his newfound candor. Later that evening, Ethan returned to his penthouse, exhausted but relieved. The board had agreed to give him time to stabilize the company's public image, though the road ahead was far from easy. He poured himself a glass of water, staring out at the city lights. His thoughts drifted to Amara. Her words echoed in his mind. "Only you can fix this." Ethan walked to his study and opened a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a photo of him and Amara from their early days, their smiles wide and unguarded. He traced his fingers over the image, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. Pulling out a notebook, he began to write, a list of goals, not for his company, but for himself. Be honest in all things. Rebuild relationships with sincerity, not manipulation. Learn what it means to truly live. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was on the right path. The following week, Ethan attended a charity gala hosted by one of his longtime business partners. The event was smaller than the lavish parties he was used to, but its focus on community and genuine connection felt refreshing. As he moved through the crowd, Ethan caught sight of a familiar figure. Amara stood near a display of artwork, her natural grace drawing people toward her. Gathering his courage, Ethan approached her. "Amara," he said softly. She turned, surprised, but not unpleasantly so. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" "Trying to make good on my promises," he said, offering a small smile. "One step at a time." Amara studied him for a moment, then nodded. "That's a good start." They stood together, the buzz of the gala fading into the background. For the first time in years, Ethan felt lighter, as though the weight he had carried for so long was finally lifting. "Maybe we'll run into each other again," Amara said, her tone light but meaningful. "Maybe," Ethan replied, a glimmer of hope in his voice. As she walked away, Ethan didn't feel the same pang of loss he had before. Instead, he felt something new, possibility. This story reminds us that it's never too late to change, to rebuild, and to strive for a better version of ourselves. If this touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who loves inspiring stories. Let's spread messages of courage and hope together.